Good morning, Tribal Jazzman Scholar. I want to talk about human culture and that collection of belief systems that can vary from one population to another population within this unique species that we call Homo sapiens. Culture is this embodiment of ideas, values, beliefs, practices, interests, and it's something that we learn as we grow, and then it becomes something we largely take for granted as true. And those are both very important aspects of this discussion. So the first part, where does culture come from? It comes from outside of our brain, partly. In other words, if you're born into the Dogon tribe in Africa, or you're born into the Inuits of northern Canada, you're going to have a very different set of values that are given to you, belief systems, worldview, cosmology. You're going to get something very different that's based on the history of that group, the climate of that region. So culture is something that we get outside. We're born into an amazingly intimate social group, and then we learn much of who we are to be, how we are to believe, what we are to do, how we are to think. We're given much of that structurally from those outside the womb as we're born into the world. And we're born extremely receptive because we don't come in very capable of taking care of ourselves. Humans are born very prematurely if you compare us to other primates. There's two things to understand about that comparison to other primates. And primates being our family, it's important to see these differences because it helps us understand what is so uniquely human as both an animal and as a species. The human being is born premature partly in response to evolutionary changes. As we became fully upright, bipedal, we call that walking on two legs, the female pelvis and male pelvis, but the female pelvis closed significantly from the other primates, and then the human brain was also growing at this rapid rate. So the head was large and the pelvis was smaller, and this demanded that we be born very prematurely so that the human fetus could pass through the pelvic opening. And we're not only born prematurely, but our skull is not fully fused. It can form itself to exit the birth canal. So what happens then is that we come out into the world very dependent upon caregivers, a very intimate one-on-one connection to our mother, usually, that lasts a year. We can't walk for a year. Every other primate can hold on to its mother within 2 or 3 days. We can't feed ourselves. So we're dependent upon this intensely intimate, connected relationship with another person who becomes our first teacher, and then the extended family. But all of us go through this as humans, this connectedness to other humans, and then we have therefore created a society where we're amazingly dependent on one another, largely cooperative. And just watch cars on a freeway and traffic, and you get this sense of how remarkably cooperative we are, what we agree to do and not do in order to all function in what can be seen as a very overpopulated world. While episodes of violence are receiving a lot of attention in the media, most human beings get along quite well with one another. We are actually an amazingly pacific species, in spite of our coalitional violence and all the other anomalies that can be described in another episode, at least some of the reasoning behind it in my mind. But to say again that culture is what we receive when we exit the womb and enter the world, and it's the embodiment of the collection of ideas, values, and belief systems that come to us from our social group. The human being grows, and another distinction from the other primates, we continue to grow for 20 years. Our brain develops for a very long period of time. Other primates are fully grown in less than half that amount of time. So another unique feature of us is that where we maybe lack some of the same instinctive guidance that our DNA might have given us through inheritance that other species seem to have automatically, we have quite a few psychological mechanisms that are certainly evolved and that guide our responses to things. We are largely the product of our cultural upbringing. We are very bound to the beliefs and values of our culture. And that's where I want to suggest that we need to begin to challenge things that are very status quo, because if you look at our cultural values and beliefs in 2011, as I'm recording this, and you go back 50 years in the same country, the same region, you go back 150 years to Americans 150 years ago, and you were to do a sort of a value analysis of the cultural beliefs, the status quo thought patterns that were guiding the human population at the time, 50 years ago and 150 years ago, we find very different value systems. And yet people would hold as tenaciously to those as we do to ours. So then you must begin to ask yourself, well, what are we holding on to that may be destined to change? What evolutionary changes might we expect in our culture in the next 50 to 100 years? And that's how we need to appreciate both the power of culture and the limitations of status quo ideas, because they're bound to change when they're not healthy for the species or the individual. The question is, how willing are we to look at those, to see those, and to challenge them? And so one of the responsibilities we have as a species that is very much the product of our culture is to question some of the things that our culture tells us, to be willing to do that, and to not see it as a threat to the viability of our group, but to see it as the way that our group will move itself into a more egalitarian world. So with that, Tribal Jazzman Scholar will sign off. Thanks for joining me. And he pushes stop, and then he's done.